and we couldn't be more delighted to be hosting Bennett. So without further ado,
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate the introduction, Professor Plummer. Mike, I'm really happy to meet for the first time. I think I'm gonna, is it more customary to remain seated or to stand?
Whatever you feel more comfortable
I
doing.
think I'll probably stand, and I've got a text I'm gonna work from, and I'm gonna take a half an hour, no more than 35 minutes, and leave at least 20 minutes for questions, discussion, challenge, criticism, because it's a controversial topic that I'm gonna put on the table here. So, well, thanks for the introduction, and I so appreciate the chance to finally come to the Bologna Center after so many years of interactions with personal friends, with colleagues who have come through this building, through this institution. Going back, at the risk of dating and aging myself, going back literally 40 years, when a friend from my time at Oxford was then here in Bologna, Martin Frankel, and called and asked me where he might live around DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And I said, I live in DuPont Circle, a block and a half from SAIS. I'll have a room this summer open up in my group house. So he was in, and the rest is history. But over the last 30 years, I've worked with a number of SAIS graduates, but especially people who come through Bologna. And I've hired at least half a dozen, beginning in my State Department incarnation. And as recently as just 4 or 5 years ago, one of your wonderful recent graduates, Adele Barzilay. So I just have tremendous appreciation for this institution, for this center. It gives you such a worldly perspective. I think from a global perspective, not just on our country, but on the international community, the global economy, and opens up pathways to career development that you maybe would not have if you were just in DuPont Circle at SAIS. So plus you lead a good life here and you have the best food in the world. So it's not a bad deal. So with all of that, I want to just begin by kind of establishing the topic, and then I'm going to make a pretty sustained, and my wife told me last night, densely analytical argument here, and I hope I'll try to lighten it up a little along the way. But the talk I'm going to give rests on a dual premise that is debatable to some, but has been a challenge to me from the very beginning of my career. And that premise is that multinational corporations exert massive power and impact, for better or worse, and that there is a legitimate and an important agenda for corporate responsibility, accountability, and sustainability, which has gained traction and momentum since the mid to late 1990s. I'll make the argument that this agenda is now at a critical crossroads, not for the first time, but perhaps with the most far-reaching stakes and consequences, not only for companies and their investors, but more significantly now for the entire world. So let's get right into it. Here we are, 6 weeks into 2023, amidst what some call polycrisis, according to Adam Tooze. Others refer to mega threats. That's Nouriel Roubini, otherwise known as Dr. Doom in the press to some. And the responsible business agenda will be tested, I think, to the greatest extent since its inception a quarter century ago, amidst this polycrisis and these mega threats. Despite recent glimmers of global economic optimism, at least according to the IMF coming out of Davos a few weeks ago, the world remains beset by crisis and threat, even as it recovers from an historic pandemic. The intensification of climate change, and severe weather, the disruption of supply chains and energy sources, the persistence of inequality and poverty, the mass movement of refugees and migrants, the specter of food insecurity and famine, all present severe intertwined challenges beyond the responsible business agenda itself, reaching across the global economy and the international community. But, and here's the core of my argument, my proposition to you, but the most fundamental source of crisis and threat, compounding all the others presented to multinational corporations, is war and conflict, superpower tension, and potential confrontation. The same warnings are being sounded. Geopolitics is the biggest threat to globalization. Don't let geopolitics kill the world economy. Geopolitics threatens to destroy the world that Davos made. Those are just three headlines of recent op-eds, each from the, I think two of the three from the FT, the Financial Times, just in the last month. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and US-China, of course, are the two most significant points of collision between geopolitics and globalization, but other countries and regions present current or potential flashpoints, which will test corporate responsibility. They already are. From Myanmar amidst the post-coup civil war, it really is now, the last 2 years, to Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the resumption of the so-called Davos in the desert, with Western financial executives in particular showing up after feeling the situation is slightly deodorized from a couple of years ago. And certain industries, most visibly extractives and technology, but also apparel, agriculture, automotive, and others, are in the crossfire. That crossfire will be especially intense at the nexus of extractives, technology, and the automotive sectors, as the just transition, as we call it, toward a lower carbon world puts a premium on critical minerals such as cobalt and lithium to power renewable sources, from wind turbines to electric vehicles. Those critical minerals, as many of you are aware, are already the focus of geopolitical competition, especially related to China. Ford Motor Company just this week came under criticism in the US for announcing a $3.5 billion venture with a Chinese manufacturer to build a EV factory in Michigan. Just take cobalt, an essential component to every lithium-ion rechargeable batteries that power our smartphones, laptops, and EVs. About 75% of the world's supply of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, still beset by the world's longest running low intensity but bloody armed conflict. Cobalt mined there makes some actors at different levels of their value chains potentially complicit in illicit trade, human rights abuses, forced and child labor. And indeed, there's a new book hot out just in the last few weeks called Red: How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives. And it tells the story in shocking detail. So, responsible business is now caught in the vortex of geopolitical, ethical, and material pressures. Intractable dilemmas for companies are turning into inescapable decisions. The dilemmas certainly challenge the roles and responsibilities of multinational corporations and institutional investors, and they may divide company shareholders and stakeholders. And in turn, they may cause tensions with both the home and host country governments of countries where they're based and where decisions, where they operate and where they source. My view is that the decisions that multinational corporations are now being forced to make, and I will take you through a few examples of tough decisions, that those decisions will lead to fewer win-win outcomes. You know, there's been a kind of default assumption in the corporate responsibility world going back a couple decades that if you do the right thing, it's a sort of win-win for everybody. That world is over, in my view, in my experience. I think now that we can no longer square a lot of these circles, and instead we're going to see more zero-sum outcomes of decisions that corporations are forced to make. Zero-sum outcomes that are going to result less in squared circles and more in jagged angles. These converging geopolitical, ethical, and material pressures force many companies and entire industries to weigh tough trade-offs and make hard choices, related in particular to the three governments at the nexus of this whole tension between geopolitics and globalization. And those three governments, of course, and not to give short shrift to the EU, but are the US, Russia, and China. So I'm going to give three examples. The first very briefly, and the second with a little more detail. The first example is not very well known. It's going to surprise you. It dismays some, it cheers others. I happen to have been in the middle of it as it was happening. And that is corporate America, Wall Street, very little reported, got extremely anxious in October 2020 as the presidential election approached, got very anxious after the first debate on September 28, 2020, when the then incumbent in the Oval Office refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. And remarkably, on the 27th of October 2020, the Business Roundtable, the US Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers issued a joint statement calling for a peaceful transfer of power and a responsible transition. Saturday, the 6th or 7th it was of November, within an hour after the networks called the election for Biden-Harris, they put out a joint statement congratulating Biden-Harris. That wasn't the point. The point was to tell the occupant of the Oval Office that the jig was up. Fast forward to January 6th, 5 o'clock East Coast time. National Association Manufacturers, ahead of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leadership on the Hill, put out a statement calling on Vice President Pence and the cabinet to convene and invoke the 25th Amendment of the US Constitution to remove the incumbent of the White House. The National Association did this, little reported, horrifying to those of us who abhor any notion of a corporate intervention in democratic elections, and cheering to those of us who feared for the very continuity of American democracy. So that happened, and it happened because corporate America and Wall Street saw the stakes that they shared in the continuity and vitality, legitimacy of American democracy as the cornerstone of the US economy, the global financial system, the global economy, and the international community. That's an example of business taking some pretty tough choices and putting aside fear, taking a stand that will appear partisan, doing what they felt was right and necessary at the time. Second example, and I'll take a little more time to develop this one, and it's China. Western multinationals have wrestled for a quarter century with labor and human rights issues in China. Apparel factories, consumer electronics factories, Nike, Apple, the rest. They've wrestled for 2 decades with censorship, surveillance, the so-called red firewall of China, online. I've been in the middle to varying extents of both those issues over the years, but as important as those issues remain, they're almost now in the rear view, or at least side view mirror, as this geopolitical tension between the US and China, with the EU in the middle and mostly aligned with the US, becomes ever more severe, and not least in the last 10 days with various balloons and UFOs and shoot downs on Canada, Australia, caught in the middle as well. And the superpower confrontation has been reinforced by protectionist trade measures and an aggressive effort by the US, really starting in the previous administration, with stricter export controls of sensitive technologies, and a big effort now by the Biden administration, supported by Congress, to develop American self-sufficiency in semiconductors, really the most vital component of the global economy, as part of a centerpiece of a broader reshoring you're aware of strategic supply chains. Apple, for example, is now under a lot of pressure can't really untether itself from what is known as its red supply chain that's so deeply entrenched in China, but is under pressure to at least lessen its dependence somewhat and shift some of that production to Vietnam and to India as it's beginning to. And Apple is not alone among major American companies now that's attracting criticism in Washington from Republicans and Democrats alike for being too close, too dependent on China. American companies now are looking for some greater degree of clarity and consistency in US-China relations. We'll see if that happens anytime soon. But let's take it to an even finer point. You're all aware of the repression of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang, Western China. That has caused a huge number of European and North American apparel brands to exit their Xinjiang, to cut their relationships with suppliers there. And that's a campaign that I've had the chance to be in the middle of with the coalition to end forced labor in the Uyghur region over the last couple of years. And that campaign's played an instrumental role in persuading the administration and Congress to pass, and they did almost unanimously, which is very rare these days on anything, to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in December of 2022. So there was a choice that companies had to make up to the passage of that legislation at the end of December 2021. The choice is now made for them by the US government. And it's not just US companies in the crossfire, it's European and other companies who import into the US. The EU is now considering its own ban on imports of goods made with forced labor. But in the meantime, some of the European brands had to take stands, H&M in particular. And some of you may recall that almost 2 years ago in the early spring of 2021, H&M stood by the content on its website opposing forced labor and saying it would no longer source from suppliers in Xinjiang. The Chinese government responded by mobilizing a massive attack against H&M on social media that had the effect of effectively canceling H&M online on the e-commerce platforms, Alibaba, Tencent, and others in China. Gone. They still have some brick and mortar stores, but big hit on their bottom line from China. So fascinating that that company, among others, took a public stand, and they took a hit knowingly. So we're still in a very tough period with China. There's a big debate now in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany about the degree of dependence the German economy has on exports to China. The German finance minister warned just last week of what he called a dangerous dependence of German companies on the China market. And he called for closer ties to what he called Germany's democratic, quote unquote, value partners. So an interesting signal from one of the most important governments on top of one of the largest economies in the world. The next example that I'll develop, and one that I'm involved with daily, is the whole aftermath of the continuing Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as some of you are aware, and it's still not as widely reported as I think it should be, but as some of you are aware, there was an exodus of hundreds of Western companies from Russia beginning at the end of February last year, just 51 weeks ago. The anniversary of the invasion is next Thursday, a week from today, the 24th. BP and Shell led the parade out, although neither is fully out. Hundreds followed. There were as many exits of Western companies from Russia in a couple of months as there were in a dozen years of Western companies from apartheid South Africa in the late 70s to the mid 1980s. It's really a remarkable movement of companies out. Yet at the same time, many of the companies that committed to leave remain partly in. They've had various difficulties in extricating themselves legally and operationally, and others, hundreds still remain in and still selling products, goods, services to the Russian market. There's a big controversy over whether consumer goods companies in particular should be selling, ice creams and chocolates and food and personal care goods. You've watched this space for more criticism there. There's been some criticism around pharma companies, but some people think they have more of a understandable defense of providing a so-called essential medicines as defined by the World Health Organization in Russia. But I think you can anticipate in the coming weeks, coming days, that there will be even more focus, negative scrutiny, and criticism of the companies which remain in Russia. And I should note here that there is also a growing danger that the companies that remain are going to be and seem to be complicit in the war effort. Also underreported is the fact that employees of foreign companies operating in Russia are subject to forcible conscription as part of this continuing mobilization of the Russian army that's not already deployed in Ukraine. I would not want to be running a Western company or a subsidiary in Russia and have my employees subject to forcible conscription. And there's a broader argument that's being made that just staying in Russia at this point is in the face of massive civilian casualties suffered by Ukrainians, massive destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. It really makes those companies, almost by definition, at least indirectly complicit in the war effort. I've been involved with a group called B for Ukraine, a Business for Ukraine, and in our declaration that we put out last summer, we characterized, as others, most notably President Zelensky characterized, the G7 have characterized Putin's invasion of Ukraine as an attack not just on Ukraine, but on the international rules-based order itself. And that really leads me to the second half of my presentation, which is to focus on this bigger picture of the relationship between multinational corporations and the international rules-based order. I should say, as a sort of a segue, that a lot of the Western multinationals, whether they're in or out of Russia, as this invasion continues, have nightmares, losing sleep, not just about Russia, Ukraine, but even more about China and a potential attack on Taiwan. And as you know, a lot of commentators view the outcome as it will play out in the coming months or even years with Russia and Ukraine is having huge, huge implications for what may or may not happen in East Asia. So this really leads to some tough dilemmas and choices for multinational corporations and in turn for institutional investors. So the C-suites and the boardrooms of Western multinationals are, or at least should be, losing sleep at night and during the day, engaging in-house or outside consultant, geopolitical and political risk analysts to game out different scenarios of what could happen. Russia and Ukraine, whether, God forbid, Putin exercises a tactical nuclear warhead, detonates that, which is morally inconceivable and yet not beyond his immoral capacity. What could possibly happen in China and with Taiwan? And the question is are companies equipped as a matter of competency, skill, but also governance to think about these issues, to analyze them? And the answer is not quite yet. I do have a solution. and I think many of you are familiar with the fact, and certainly Michael has been familiar with it his whole career, that for half a century now, multinational corporations have been doing varying degrees of political risk analysis, for God's sake, at a domestic level and at a geopolitical level. And there's well-known political risk advisory firms that do very well by developing and selling exactly this kind of risk analysis. But at the same time, what's developed over in recent years, and I've been involved in it since its inception 2 decades ago, is the concept some of you are aware of, human rights due diligence. And that goes back to the early 2000s with the first human rights impact assessment done. It was done for BP in Indonesia 20 years ago. But fast forward to 2011, Professor John Ruggie, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights due diligence embedded in those principles, and now really taking off. And there's no silver linings to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but if there's any, at least from a from a practical standpoint, it's at least that human rights due diligence is given a fresh focus and new impetus. And there's a significant new report put out last June by the UN Development Program and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights due diligence in high-risk, conflict-sensitive areas that I commend to your reading attention. But what I think we really need to do is meet companies and investors partway between where they are and where we'd like them to be. And I therefore think that there's a real need and an opportunity for what I call a fusion between political risk, geopolitical risk analysis, which is established, and human rights due diligence, which is still not as well known and embraced as it needs to be. And there's plenty of tools around human rights due diligence now in a conflict context. It's all over the web. A lot of it is great, great, great stuff. And I think that had companies done a fusion of political risk analysis, human rights due diligence, when Russia seized Crimea in 2014, they may have seen in the fighting in the Donbass, they would have seen the writing on the wall for this invasion that happened 51 weeks ago today. So I think that human rights due diligence is a stepping stone for what companies can and should do. But I want to just get to the bigger picture here before I conclude in a few minutes and say that what's at stake, in my view, in these examples that I've offered of the remarkable intervention of corporate America at Wall Street in the US presidential election, the significant exodus, even if incomplete, definitely incomplete, of Russia, of Western companies from Russia, and also the tensions that companies face with China and the decisions some have made and the consequences some have felt. What's really at stake here for multinational corporations and institutional investors is no less than the continuity and efficacy of the rules-based international order that defines the international community and underpins the global economy. I believe that individual companies and entire industries share a stake in supporting and defending this order at a time when its stability and even its legitimacy are under severe stress. Multinational corporations, intentionally or not, have been among the greatest beneficiaries of that international rules-based order in the last 3/4 of a century since its creation amidst the ashes of World War II. Yet at times they seem to take it for granted, even though rules, standards, norms are the absolute bedrock of trade and investment, innovation and entrepreneurship, the whole basis through which they get to their markets and customers, all depend on the continuity and vitality of the international rules-based order. It really is the essential framework that allows global trade and commerce. And it also provides the framework to ease the climate crisis and spur the just transition to a lower carbon world. So I've been thinking really the last 10 months or so about where, with the whole proposition around multinationals, international community, global economy at such serious risk, is there a new notion of what I call geopolitical corporate responsibility? I think there is. It's a big phrase. I don't intend to imply or offer a doctrine, but I think that there's a pragmatic agenda around the idea of geopolitical corporate responsibility that can help multinational corporations and institutional investors address the dilemmas inherent at the convergence of these geopolitical, ethical, and material pressures. So I think what companies can do very practically is first, they can avoid situations where they cause, contribute, or directly link to human rights abuses consistent with the UN guiding principles. Second, they can advocate for what I've called the shared space, the rule of law, accountable governance, and civic freedoms that should link business and civil society. Rule of law, accountable governance, civic freedoms. Those are the underpinnings of civil society itself and the underpinnings of sustainable and profitable business and investment environments. I think that companies should do a more consistent job and even start thinking about supporting, in the words of SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, supporting peace, justice, and strong institutions. How does business thrive or even survive without peace, justice, and strong institutions at the national and both the international level? Business should demonstrate a sustained commitment to enhance equity, transparency, and accountability. They should work more consistently and creatively to diminish inequality by tackling poverty and ensuring sustainability by arresting the climate crisis. None of these prescriptions are new. All have some precedent, all have some standards and practice and literature around them, but none of them are taken seriously enough. None of them are front and center in C-suites and corporate boards. None of them have been coordinated and integrated and activated to the extent that they should, given the priority and urgency, I think, that the business world should see at this time of such severe stress for the global economy and the international community. And look, I keep talking about this rules-based international order. It's not perfect, it's not pure, it's not pristine, it never has been, it never will, it can be or will be. It's had its imperfections, its inconsistencies, its hypocrisies, but it's the best that we've got, you know, and there's been an imbalance and we have to revise, rework some of the architecture of the international community in particular. I mean, how do we move forward in the 21st century world with a P5, permanent 5 in the UN Security Council, with 3 European countries and the United, you know, Russia, China, you know, US, UK, France. Where's India? Where's Brazil? Where's Nigeria? I mean, is this really legitimate? I would say not. That's going to take some time. The politics of that are going to be incredibly difficult. And the West, I have to say, and the US government has a lot to answer for when it comes to nobody and wanting to see Saddam Hussein toppled. But the way it was done without the consent and legitimacy of the international community, as was achieved in the first Gulf War, but not the second, really helped discredit this very international rules-based order, of which the US has long been the principal architect, custodian, and defender. So there's a lot to answer for here. We need to have a more balanced world, east-west, the north and south. So I'm just going to wrap up with an aside that will then offer you a slight challenge, and that is this whole set of tensions and conflicts that I've tried to characterize, this whole convergence of geopolitical, ethical, and material pressures that multinational corporations have to try to balance, must, are. All takes place against the backdrop of a whole backlash against ESG in the US. That backlash is heard, but not really felt in Europe or the rest of the world. It's mostly an American phenomenon. You're aware of it. The attacks on so-called woke capitalism. There are people on the left who think that ESG, sustainable investing, is a bunch of whitewashing, greenwashing, and bluewashing. I didn't feel that way when I led the Calvert SRI platform for 9 years. We did our very best to construct our funds according to strict ESG criteria. We had a team of 20 ESG analysts working day and night to make sure that the companies that we passed, if not perfect, at least met minimum reasonable standards. But there's a serious valid criticism of ESG from the left, from the right, from the center, of inconsistent criteria, metrics, portfolio construction, fund names, and marketing. It's been a bit of a mess. These are growing pains. There's an effort underway now to rationalize, consolidate, separate the wheat from the chaff. It will work. It won't work as quickly or perfectly as some like me and others would hope, but it's going to sort itself out. But at the same time, there's this attack. It's really coming from the political right. It's coming from one political party in particular. It's against woke, so-called woke capitalism. ESG is caught up in the culture wars, as some call it, in the United States. I think that the differences in that debate, unlike the debate over methodology, it's really a technical methodological debate, and we can fix those problems mostly. But there's this political and ideological fight, not just debate. And I think that the differences are probably irreconcilable because they reflect fundamentally different understanding of the whole premises and purposes of responsible business, and indeed just how people think about roles and responsibilities of business, government, society at large, the interaction between states and markets, and at the risk of sounding fancy, the balance between democracy and capitalism. We're not going to reconcile those differences, particularly as American politics have become so polarized and so fused with these culture wars. So there's going to be this battle over ESG. There's a backlash. There's now a backlash against the backlash. I'm optimistic that we'll sort out the technical methodological issues. We'll have a more credible suite of ESG and investment products. I'm not optimistic that we're going to sort out soon, if ever, the political and ideological fight. So to conclude, you're thinking about your career paths here. And I think that getting into this arena, whether you work at an NGO or a social enterprise or a multinational corporation or an institutional investor, so-called ESG investor, whether you work for a government, international institution, you will inevitably have to work with and across these sectors. You're going to have to deal, if you're in the business world, with policy issues. If you're in the policy world, with these trade investment, business, and commercial issues, it's inevitable. They're increasingly intertwined. And it's about, in my view, understanding that 21st century world isn't decided just by governments anymore. It's the nexus, the points of intersection, the points of conflict, tension, but also discussion, consensus, standard setting, policy making, where the different sectors come together. And that's where I think that the action increasingly is. And I think that the notion of geopolitical corporate responsibility, if it can take root, even partly along the lines I've described, I think can help address some of these tensions and conflicts between democracy and capitalism, between globalization and geopolitics. So I just hope that the corporate world, the investment world, can rise to the challenge of trying to fortify the embattled remnants of the international rules-based order. I think that's the challenge for responsible business and investment. It's a challenge for all of us as citizens and activists, shareholders and stakeholders. And I think that's the challenge for students as you decide how your life's work will contribute to a better world. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that really interesting overview of many of these challenges generally, there's challenges to the rule-based system, and the role of multinationals in it. Why don't we open it up for questions? Yeah, please say your name.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Tasia Thornton. I'm a first-year master's in international relations student. I had a question of what you see as the future and role of shareholder activism and shareholder proposals for corporations. I know over the past couple of years, we've seen a massive rise in ESG shareholder activism, particularly in the States. A lot of it has been surrounding human rights and climate change and racial equity. Do you see that gaining traction, and what do you see as the future and how that might push corporations to engage on ESG issues?
I love the question, and I lived in that question as senior vice president Calvert for 9 years, and I still live weekly, if not daily, in the question. It's a wonderful question, and I'm going to force myself to try to give you a 2-minute answer so that we can get to other questions and issues. Shareholder advocacy is critically important. It's gained a lot of traction. I think the volume of shareholder proposals on ESG issues has risen significantly. I've been especially interested, given my human rights background at the State Department, in the so-called S issues, and those have risen significantly as well. And you know, investors have been working on human rights issues, the old SRIs, as we called them, the faith-based investors, particularly in the US, going back to the late 80s, early 90s. 5 years ago, we created I say we because I was part of it, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, which tries to coordinate a lot of the shareholder proposals and engagement with companies. There is some pushback on shareholder resolutions in the context of not the technical and methodological, but political and ideological dimension of this backlash against ESG that I just mentioned. So some of the big institutional asset owners and managers back kind of defensively and being a little more selective and sparing on what proposals that they might co-file, or even support. I think it's going to be regrettable if they pull back too much. I can understand being a little more selective. I think, you know, I felt even in our work at Calvert, we had to pick our spots a little bit and do 12 things and not 15. But the shareholder advocacy agenda is going to go forward. That said, I took a broader view in leading the Calvert SRI platform. I felt that shareholder resolutions were indispensable, and I encouraged my team to do one after another. We did 36 a year on average in the 9 years I was there. Many focused on diversity on corporate boards, but on many, many other topics. I, though, put an emphasis on a couple of other dimensions of shareholder advocacy that did not require resolution. Sometimes, I'll say, to the disappointment of some of my team, I put even more emphasis, at least in my time, on direct dialogue and engagement with companies. And I felt, maybe this is the former diplomat in me, if you file a resolution if it's necessary to get their attention, no hesitation if you need to get their attention. But if you have a relationship, use the relationship first to start a dialogue. So it's a tactical decision. It's not one is better than the other. I felt, though, given the relationships I had coming into it and developed along the way, that it was useful. So we ended up doing dialogues at the corporate staff, senior corporate executive level, and sometimes at the C-suite and director and CEO level, some of the biggest corporations in the world. The other thing that we did was we got very heavily into the standard setting and public policy business. So I was frankly less interested in, again, in terms of my personal time, I was less interested in a fabulous resolution that got an article in the press, and more interested in a long-term initiative that would get little or no press for half a dozen years, but might change an entire industry, not just one company 10 years later. We were successful. So before I got to Calvert, they developed the Calvert Women's Principles. I had the chance then to work with the city of San Francisco to create the San Francisco Gender Equity Principles, and with the UN to create the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, now with 5,000 companies globally in them. We co-founded the Global Network Initiative. Instead of tossing Google and Microsoft and Yahoo out of our portfolios in 06-07 because of human rights abuses in China and their connection to them, we created a global standard for freedom of expression and right to line, right to privacy online. And there's dozens of companies in it around the world. And I was proud to have been vice chair of it. And we got no headlines, but it changed the whole industry. And similarly, we created the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Initiative, Calvert, Aviva investors, together with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in London and the Institute for Human Rights and Business and others. That's the premier corporate benchmarking initiative in the world. So I love shareholder resolutions. They're here to stay. God bless them. God help us if we ever lose them. But we need a bigger toolbox. And one of my main areas of focus, Calvert, was to build and exercise the bigger toolbox of shareholder advocacy, and including public policy. We played a leading role in Dodd-Frank 1502 on disclosure of due diligence efforts around curtailing conflict minerals in Congo, and Dodd-Frank 1504 on requiring oil and mining companies to disclose revenue payments, taxes to often corrupt governments around the world. So we did big picture, long-term standard setting, not just the short-term corporate policy fixes. Both are critical. So thanks for the question. Yes.
So I have a question about China and Taiwan.
Yeah.
We've seen recently the decoupling, so-called, and the decrease in investment in some sectors in China.
Yeah.
And as a result, it has created an increase in risk expectation for Taiwan. And so we've also seen a decrease in investment in Taiwan. So in a way, corporate activism or ESG is increasing the risk for Taiwan because there's less interest vested in Taiwan, and is brought back to the US, for example, with the semiconductors. So how do you think ESG can deal with this kind of contradictory?
That's a really smart question, and I don't have a really good answer other than, I understand why it's unsustainable, unwise for the US, Europe, the rest of the world to rely so overwhelmingly on supply of semiconductors from TSMC in Taiwan. I mean, that's crazy. We have to diversify the supply, and President Biden and the Congress, I think, are right on it, although it's causing some transatlantic tensions, and all of a sudden the US is doing industrial policy European style that we had avoided for decades. I though feel, and this is the international rules-based order, small d Democrat guy in me, that Taiwan is one of the most admirable success stories in the world. When I was a student, Taiwan was still a semi-authoritarian, semi-dictatorship, and its transformation into one of the most vibrant democracies, not just in Asia, but in the world in the last quarter century, is just historic and remarkable. It's so cheering. And yeah, they get in fights in their legislature sometimes, but what the hell. So I think I really hope the corporations in the whole world stand by Taiwan and continue to invest in that incredibly vibrant economy and democracy, even as we must, for obvious economic and strategic reasons, diversify the semiconductor supply chain in particular. But by help, we've got to stand by Taiwan. And President Biden has been pretty clear, more clear than some would like, who prefer what we call strategic ambiguity about US intentions, when he says, yes, we'll defend Taiwan. So for those of us who are small d Democrats, whether on the left of center or right of center of the spectrum, Taiwan is a source of great admiration and should be commitment. And when I was growing up, Taiwan was the darling of the Republican right, who used it to bash soft Democrats who were soft on red China. We've come a long way, but I love the question.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Kind of related to this? And, I'm spending a good deal of time in Florida these days, so forgive me if I'm being cynical about politics. But I remember in the late 80s, the AFL-CIO petitioned the US government to withdraw GSP privileges for the country because of labor rights abuses or certain parts of the labor corps that were not up to stuff. And then you had Mahathir at the time as prime minister said, you know, we were just pulling up oil from the ground and you know, rubber from the trees. Nobody cared about how we treated our labor. And now all of a sudden we're competing with you and you care about it. Now you mentioned the case of Shenzhen in China, and you know, the law in October, and we'll move to Vietnam. Vietnam is also a dictatorship of the proletariat. And yet you've got this political agenda in the United States where being anti-China is the only thing we agree on both sides of the platform. And then I see your point about Taiwan. I think my own view, having studied Asia a long time, I think the probability of China's militarily going after Taiwan is extremely low, but increases when you send, you know, the Speaker of the House of Representatives to Taiwan and things. So,
Yeah.
and why do you do that? Well, there's the political thing. So how do you sort this out? And I mean, you know, we've got corporations. Shouldn't they know how to manage their supply chains? Do we need, and you know, you may be 100% right that it's important for the US government to have a say in these things, but you could also be a cynic, couldn't you?
Yeah, of course you can. In fact, a cynic could challenge much of what I've had to say, or frankly, much of what I've done or my colleagues have done over the years to try to promote corporate responsibility and accountability. I mean, but you make a very, very good point. I mean, first on Mahathir, God, he's still alive. He's pushing 100.
Yes.
Cranky,
He was
redoubtable.
prime minister again 3 years ago.
It's just incredible. You know, I remember he used to tweet Margaret Thatcher, and as a non-fan of both Mahathir and Thatcher, I didn't have a dog in that fight. But yeah, I kind of felt this. You know, you mentioned I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for DRL, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and I led our human rights dialogue with Vietnam twice in 99 and 2000 and 99 in Hanoi. And I also did a parallel trip to Cambodia, met with the Prime Minister Hun Sen then and now, and much of the cabinet, and dealt with exactly these kinds of issues, you know, where we sort of come in on our high horse with, you know, in my case, trying to express and embody a little bit of humility, not least, but in both those countries in particular, given our history in both in the 60s and 70s. But, you know, I guess my feeling is, and this is very honest, is that we carry immense baggage. We carry, you know, baggage that has a large tonnage of hypocrisy and tragedy in it, but we also carry a lot of baggage with a lot of idealism and a lot of good. And we have to be more frank about our shortcomings. And, you know, I think that, you know, President Biden has done a good job of that. President Obama was particularly eloquent, you know, in our view of the world of how, you know, we come at this as a work in progress ourselves, and he was eloquent on just that. But, you know, I think it's a fair observation that it was really only in the 90s that we started talking about, you know, global labor standards, corporate responsibility, even though the ILO, as you know, was created, in 1919. It's the only surviving Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations institution. But the whole dialogue agenda around international labor rights and multinational corporations and supply chains only really got going in the 90s. So it was inevitable that there were going to be some disjunctions and hypocrisies. I hope that we've done a better job on it. And yet we still struggle with the tension between, you know, trying to lift standards on the one hand and being protectionist about it on the other. And again, I had to deal with this. I remember a pretty tough conversation with the Commerce Minister of Cambodia in Phnom Penh in July of 1999. You know, where he was basically begging me to, you know, raise the import quotas for Cambodian textile imports into the US on the grounds that they were making some initial progress on workers' rights. And, you know, I was saying, yes, we'll do what we can, but we're not going to increase the quotas much very quickly. And I had breathing over my back, and I wasn't the only decision maker, but the AFL-CIO back in Washington, the garment workers unions, hardliners, elsewhere in the administration. And yet listening to this guy saying we need to keep a relatively low competitive wage base, you know, to employ mostly unskilled women workers. And yes, we're raising standards, but for God's sake, let us import more and don't put screws to us too quickly. And I understood that. And it's a lot of balancing, and it's a lot of imperfect outcomes, and it's a bit of a mess, but that's how it actually works. But those are great questions. But I guess the most important thing, I have to segue into just one really personal anecdote that shook me up. That's not really about trade and economics, but when I led that human rights dialogue in Hanoi in July of '99, the afternoon before, there was a lunch given for me and my delegation, our delegation, by my opposite number, who was a dozen or 15 years older, who outranked me. He was probably the equivalent of an undersecretary of state. He then was promoted almost immediately after to be their ambassador to the UN. I mean, this was a guy maybe 15 or 20 years my senior and 2 levels up from me. And he was so in perfect English, urbane, gracious, beautiful 3-hour lunch. It was basically dinner. Warm. Next morning, foreign ministry, huge, long, rectangular conference room. He's in the center on his side, flanked by his aides. I'm on the center on our side, flanked by the guy I brought with me from Washington and several people from the embassy. He begins intoning in this cold voice, after the warmth of the previous afternoon. Mr. Freeman, welcome to you and your delegation for our human rights dialogue. And I thought it would be important for you to know that as we begin our human rights dialogue, that 20X, I can't remember, years ago, mid-60s, my mother was killed by American bombs. And the air just kind of went out of the room, and I was deathly silent and stricken for 3 seconds, and then grabbed a hold of myself and said the only reasonable, decent thing anybody, I think, could say, which was to say how sorry I was for his personal tragedy and his country's tragedy and the tragic history that our country shared, and that will not be forgotten. But at the same time, we reestablished diplomatic relations, and our relationship is strong enough now that we can have a sense of dialogue even on the most sensitive human rights issues. And we deeply respect and appreciate your willingness to discuss these issues with us. I mean, what the hell else could I say? But it's what you have to deal with. And as an American in a world not an American human rights diplomat, for all the good we've done, you have to carry around a big bag of humility wherever you go. So that I'll never, to my dying day, I will remember that moment. A little off topic, but I thought of interest.
I'm Professor Jackie Matza. I teach both in Washington and here in Bologna, but most importantly, I did my MA with Martin Frankel in Washington and in Bologna, and I am sure I went to a party at Martin and Bennett's house.
1702 P Street. We had these parties.
I've been there.
The parties were two-thirds my Mondale presidential campaign kids, 1/3 SAIS, mostly European SAIS students, and it was the most exotic mix in town. Boy, did we have fun.
And this is what I told my students all the time. You have no idea when you fast forward your careers where you will continue to encounter SAIS people, friends of SAIS people, your whole career. So do not burn any bridges with any of your colleagues here. So I was really struck. You made some really, really thoughtful and interesting points here. So I wanted to just pick up on two that are related. One, you talked about business needing to widen its political risk lens, particularly after Russia and now with China. And I was particularly struck wondering, are people widening their political lens with China? Or where do you see business thinking about that in the context of Russia? And I really liked also bringing to everyone here what's happening in the US with the concept of woke capitalism. And there, we see the hypocrisy of China versus Russia. Somehow some, authoritarian governments are woke capitalism and some authoritarian governments are not.
Yeah.
And so where do you see some of those dilemmas affecting how people change behavior towards both China and Russia now?
Oh, God. Okay, we got to
Who
talk
raised
later.
these
too.
issues?
Yeah. So just a couple quick reactions. So first, it's hard to tell to what extent companies, the C-suites and the boards are wrestling with the geopolitical risks issues. I think that it's hard to get a window in unless you have a direct relationship with the company, or you read the FT in particular closely and see what companies are saying. I would be shocked if there was not a significant uptick in C-suite and board level discussions, these issues in the last year, particularly in the Russia-Ukraine and the China context. I'd say the last couple of years in the China context, because the heat really turned up on Xinjiang, late 2020, early 2021. I neglected to mention, by the way, the fire that the Beijing Olympic sponsors came under. I was quite deeply involved in that as well. So some of these companies have, in-house political risk analysts, scenario planners. Shell famously has had a scenario planning team for 30 or 35 years, I think now. Then there are some of the big political risk consultancies and advisory firms. There's Maplecroft for Risk, which actually comes closer than anybody, I think, to doing this fusion that I'm calling for, political risk analysis and human rights due diligence. There's the Eurasia Group, and then Albright Stonebridge and McClarty and some of the others who do advise companies on these issues. But what I think though is really necessary is boards, and not just the CEOs, are equipped and empowered to make some really tough decisions here. And I think too often the decisions are made by CEOs alone or without full consent of the boards. The recent implosion of GE, if you read some of the books published in the last year on that, show you how lousy board governance was at that formerly marquee company. So I worry a little bit. I was part of the World Economic Forum report that came out 8 or 9 months ago, calling for greater focus on human rights at the corporate board level, and I hope that has some resonance now. So, but what I'm absolutely certain of is, without knowing fully which companies actually are dealing with this, that it's inescapable. One company I will call out for putting out a fascinating forthright statement, I think on Monday, that has not yet been reported, but it's online, is Unilever, which is among the Western companies that have remained in Russia. They've had a very difficult time extricating themselves from various subsidiaries, and they've taken criticism for continuing to sell everything from personal care products to food, including ice cream, which seems rather frivolous. And yet they put out a pretty forthright, in my opinion, statement explaining the very practical, operational, legal dilemmas they face in extricating themselves, and basically laying out the different options they've considered and landing on what they think is the least bad one, which is remaining for at least short term while continuing to suspend any new employment or investments in the country. Now, I may not agree with their decision, but at least I would commend them for being transparent and accountable, like it or not, about their decision making. That's an example of a thoughtful company. And some of my friends I work with and trying to get Western companies out of Russia are still not happy with them, I'm sure, even after that statement. But that's the kind of wrestling that companies are doing behind the scenes. Your other question about the woke capitalism, I'll just be very quick on because we could talk all afternoon about that one in particular. But there's a lot of hypocrisy going around that as well. And to call companies woke that take a stand here or there for climate or just transition or labor, human rights, or civil rights in the US, Black Lives Matters in the wake of some of the horrific incidents that we've had. I mean, you can call them woke, I guess, but to me that's a stretch. I mean, there's companies, there's a whole debate, and I've been part of this to some extent, around when is it reasonable and even legitimate for companies to take a public stand. And my view is that companies are not by definition or shouldn't be political advocates by vocation, but they're inevitably drawn into social and environmental issues that appear political, even if not partisan. And those issues in turn appear partisan to partisans on both sides. And I think companies need to be selective. And I'm basically a proponent of companies taking stands in some, even many circumstances, but I would advise companies, as I have behind the scenes, to be selective. So I'll give you an example of where I think a line was crossed. And this is the hottest button issue in America. I mean, what could be hotter than abortion rights, which I've supported ever since I came to political life or, adolescence, unequivocally, supporting right to choose. But, I would not have, before the reversal of the Roe decision, urged companies to take a stand on that issue, unless maybe they're in the healthcare space and they're CVS or Walgreens and they sell products related to contraception or something. But once that line was crossed with that decision, it puts employees, not just citizens, health and lives at stake, and access to medicines, which is a human right, at stake, then I think there's a legitimate need for companies to speak out, and all the economic and social implications of companies continuing to operate in states that then pass totally draconian laws that don't even permit abortion when there's rape or incest. I mean, I'll just say crazy stuff. So, I think companies have to be very careful, but that's an example of a sensitive issue on a scale of 1 to 10, sensitive about a 90, where I would have, until that decision, say maybe you don't want to touch that one unless you have to, but that line was crossed. We can talk about a lot of other issues, but this is not going to go away. And we're not going to resolve this fight over ESG on the ideological and political level. I think, as I said, we can fix most of the technical and methodological problems. And not that that's easy, but that's very doable. And there's focus on it, it's going to happen. But, we're going to be at this. And as you develop your careers, again, you're going to cross, whether you're in or out of the business world, you're going to be dealing with exactly this stuff every week, no matter what you're doing. I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you please talk about insurance companies? How have they been, behaving in the current situation, and where do you see their role? Do they have power on their own to impact geopolitical events?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never worked with insurance companies, and I'm a world-class non-expert on them. So I'm going to be very sparing in my remarks. I've worked with most sectors, but not insurance. But one thing I'll say that I do know, and then I'll sort of semi-speculate on something I don't really know. But what I do know is that some big insurance companies, particularly European ones, and I'm thinking of Swiss Re in particular, have been very progressive and constructive on climate. Going back 10 or a dozen years, they've taken leading roles in warning of the risks of the climate crisis, of severe weather. They've been building those risk assessments into their policies. They've been doing a lot of educating and informing and engaging clients on climate risk. The insurance industry, I have the impression overall, or at least some of the leading companies especially in Europe, I don't know so much about the US or elsewhere, especially in Europe, have been very, very good. When it comes to the geopolitical issues, Russia, Ukraine, China, elsewhere, I'm not really familiar, so I can't really give you much of an answer other than to offer an educated, semi-educated guess that with the big insurance companies have probably always had people who do political and geopolitical risk, but they've probably amped that up very, very significantly, and that there probably have been new policies written around China, Taiwan in particular, and probably policies cashed in or modified in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I can't really tell you more than that because it's a sector I just don't really know. But I think they've been quite laudable on the climate stuff, on the climate side. But do you know more than I do? You probably do.
No, I actually
Yeah.
don't, because I'm Ukrainian, so
Oh.
I've been following the war very closely.
Yeah,
But it's one area they never cover in
Yeah.
the media. What's going on because behind every deal that is, being done, there is an insurance company. And I think insurance companies may have a lot of power.
Yes.
in those decision-making
Yeah.
processes and the sanctions and the whole, idea of
Yeah.
cutting Russia's revenues.
exactly.
So I was just thinking
it's
maybe.
Yeah,
something
you
else
know,
more about it.
The FT is likely to be doing more coverage, and we'll see if they covered all this more than everybody else, and we'll see if they get into the insurance side. I hope your family and friends are safe, and
I'm lucky to be from Kiev, so
Yeah.
thanks God Kyiv is not occupied,
Good.
so it's relatively safe, but again, everything is relative now.
I'm very much in solidarity. I'm one of the founders and leaders of a group called B for Ukraine. And I'm on the steering committee. I've spent a dozen or more hours every week on this and on the cause. And I work with several in particular wonderful Ukrainian colleagues, one in London, one in Copenhagen, but several in Kyiv. And we're on these Zoom calls and the power goes off and they're in the dark. And, when there's a missile strike or power outage, it's quite dramatic. But I'm with you. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah, my name is Alessandro Neri, I'm an associate fellow here. And I want to thank you for your very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Also for my sins, I sit as an independent director on the board of an Italian bank, which luckily doesn't have any activities in Russia or China, but a lot of our large corporate customers do. Of course, the bonus means that they are probably fine, right?
The bank is not happy that you're asking this question.
Of course, we talk mostly about multinational corporations, but I believe that what banks do have
Of course.
a very important bearing on
Of
what
course.
corporates do, and we have large customers who do business in Russia and China, etc. But I want to focus a little bit more on what you said about the ESG area, because of course banking is a very regulated sector, but we're getting very vague indications in terms of rules from the authorities about, everybody's for ESG, and we have taken on board a lot of stuff, but we don't really know what the authorities want. Only very recently the European central banks from we are regulated without these guidelines, but we're still in a very vague area. The other thing, second comment is that it seems that at some point the banks are becoming the enforcer of this.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm not sure it's the right role for them. I mean, when the authorities do not quite know how to force corporates to do something, they tell banks, well, you should stop lending to them if they do this or that, and I'm not sure, I want your comment on this, if banks should be the enforcers of rules on this. And the third very quick point is that once we come to the rules, it's quite likely that we get different regulation, for instance, in the US, in the EU, as it has happened for many other things, taxation and all capital requirements. And so that may fragment the international rule based over there
That's
rather
right.
than putting it together on this particular issue, which is, on the other hand, a global issue which should be dealt in a more uniform way.
Wonderful comments. Thank you. So I'll respond very quickly, and banking sector is one that I'm not expert in, but I know a little bit about it. It's hugely important. I should have mentioned it, but I think that banks are put in a difficult position when they are the default standard setters or these rule makers, and I don't think that's sustainable. But unfortunately, there are gaps in these standards, and there's gaps in practice, and banks are as well equipped as any entities to fill some of those gaps. So, for example, one area that I would like to think there are discussions between banks and major clients, and I'm sure there have been, in fact, I know there have been, is around development finance, say big extractive projects, oil, gas, and mining. And there are huge issues, as you know, around human rights, conflict zones, indigenous communities, South and Southeast Asia, Central America, South America, really all over the world, Australia. And some banks do look at these issues. One bank I'm familiar with that I've done some work with off and on the last few years is ABN AMRO, the huge Dutch bank based in Amsterdam. They're one of the biggest banks in the world. And they've, I think, have developed a more proactive human rights policy and program, working, both to have human rights criteria applied to some of their lending decisions, but also dialogue with clients. I think of any bank in Europe or the world. I think ABN AMRO. I mean, they put on a half-day conference just on a report that I did with the SAIS graduate a few years ago on why business should be supporting civic freedoms and human rights defenders around the world. They did a whole half-day conference with 150 people just on a report on that subject. I mean, it's quite remarkable. So I would urge you to take a look at ABN AMRO. I know that in the US, not to play favorites, because this bank I happen to have my account with, and they happen to be founded by Italian immigrants in my hometown of San Francisco, but Bank of America, really it has been emerged as the leader among the big US banks on the ESG front across the board. And I do think I don't know how much they work on the S, which is really more my area, but I think they've been pretty good on the environmental and climate issues. And their CEO, Brian Moynihan, is pretty forthright in his support for ESG, even in the face, especially in the face of these attacks. In terms of the disconnect between some of the standards, particularly US EU, if I'm a director of a bank or a corporation, for God's sake, I will go crazy having to deal with conflicting or inconsistent standards. That's why the former CEO of GE, Jeff Immelt, in the late 2000s, gave a speech in Brussels saying we need a transatlantic or at least a global standard on carbon accounting, so that a global company like GE can plan around that. And that remains as valid now as it was when he made that speech over a dozen years ago. So now we have a gap. Some of the regulations started in the US. The California Supply Chain Transparency Act was enacted in 2011. That was hugely influential on the UK Modern Slavery Act, enacted in 2014 or 15, which in turn has been hugely influential, more than the California Act, all around the world, Australia, Canada, now EU, huge. Likewise, we started, I mentioned in the US, Dodd-Frank 1502 on conflict minerals, 1504 on extractive revenue transparency. I was in the middle of both of those. But we've fallen behind now. We're catching up with carbon disclosures the SEC is working on. But as you know, I think everybody in the room knows, the action is really now with the EU with this big initiative on corporate sustainability disclosure, with the big draft put out a year ago. It's still in the comment period and it has to go through the council, the presidency, and the parliament. but that will essentially be the global standard for mandatory environmental human rights due diligence. And the North American companies and companies based elsewhere in the world, particularly those that operate in the EU, are going to have to live by those standards. So it's messy, but there will be convergence. I just wish that the US was back fully online, but with the divided government, we can't get anything through our House of Representatives along these lines. They would call it woke capitalism. But the leadership now is in the EU. It's in the EU, God bless it. And, you know, Italian companies and banks can become, you know, are to varying extents leaders. NL is a major leader on climate and renewables. I follow them a little bit. They're very, very good. They're very influential globally, for example. But thanks for the observations and good luck on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately,
Yep.
I think we have to give up our
Yeah.
room and everything. So, Bennett, thanks so much for not only an extremely informative and insightful talk, but also very balanced one on a very difficult issue on which to be balanced. So
Thank you.
thanks once again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I so appreciated your comments and questions. Just fantastic. Thank you so much. Great.
It's the wildest.
Look familiar.
I know I was at. the
We had
house.
several huge, they started with like 30 or 40, we got like 120 people.
Don't talk about parties in the street.
I know, they'll think.
And they-
oh,
it was
restaurant.